a blockade, a continent cut off from the sea, and an emperor, the man who had just redrawn the map of Europe, standing inside a factory, watching a machine turn a root into crystals. Not a weapon, not gold, sugar. In 1812, at the height of his struggle with Britain, Napoleon ordered enormous fields turned over to a single crop and pushed hundreds of new sugar works across his empire. A wartime industrial program built around a vegetable you could pull out of any garden. A dull, heavy, purple-red root that stains your hands and hides itself underground. The beet. And here's the part that outlived him. 2 centuries later, that gamble never really ended. Roughly a fifth of all the sugar in the world still comes from this exact root. A quiet monument to a war most people have forgotten, sitting in the sugar bowl. So the real question isn't just why an emperor at war cared about a vegetable. It's how an ordinary root ended up buried inside a war, an empire, and the white sugar in your kitchen right now. To answer that, you have to leave the battlefield entirely and go back thousands of years to a plant that looks nothing like the beet you know. Not in a field, not in a garden, on a windswept shoreline somewhere along the coast of Europe or the Mediterranean, in salty soil where most plants struggle, something green and tough is growing. Thick, glossy leaves, low to the ground. This is sea beet, and every beet humans have ever eaten, every beetroot, every stalk of chard, every field of sugar beet and fodder beet descends from this plant or its close relatives. It does not have a swollen red root. That's the first surprise. The thing we now treat as the entire point of the beet, that fat purple bulb, simply isn't there in the wild ancestor. What sea beet has is leaves, and leaves were the point. Look closer at this wild plant, because it explains everything that follows. Sea beet is a survivor. It grows where almost nothing else will bother to. The thin, salt-poisoned strip between the farmland and the tide. Ground so hostile that most crops would die in it within a week. To live there, the plant learned to be tough, to store what it needed, to endure salt and wind and drought and neglect. None of those were traits humans designed. They were the plant's own answer to a brutal address, and every one of them would later turn out to be useful to us, long after we dragged it inland and forgot where it came from. The hardiness that lets sea beet cling to a cliff is the same hardiness that would let a beet sit in a frozen cellar for 6 months, or feed a city under blockade. The plant was pre-armed for a history nobody had written yet. Historians of the plant think sea beet was gathered as wild food for thousands of years, with domestication probably beginning in the Near East. The earliest selection wasn't aimed downward at the root. It was aimed at the leaves, which is why the same family later gave us chard and leaf beet, grown to this day for their greens. So the beet arrives in human history the wrong way round. The part we now ignore was the part people wanted. The part we now prize barely existed, which leaves an obvious question. If the beetroot wasn't there at the start, where did it come from? The answer is us. Generation after generation, farmers saved seed from the plants they liked best, better leaves, sturdier stalks, and, eventually, fatter roots. And think about what that early choice actually meant. When the first farmers knelt in the dirt and decided which plants to keep, they weren't thinking about roots at all. They wanted greens, something to boil, something to wilt, something to eat now. So for a very long stretch of the beet's domestication, the underground part of the plant was almost an afterthought, a thin, forked, stringy thing you'd never look at twice. The giant swollen root we buy today is not the beginning of the beet's story. It is a late invention, coaxed out of the plant over centuries by people who kept asking it, quietly, to put a little more of itself below the surface. The beet didn't drift toward us on its own. We pulled it, and it followed. The vegetable in the supermarket is, in a real sense, a record of thousands of years of human choices, a slow argument between people and a plant about what it should become. Move forward to the classical Mediterranean, and the beet is a known plant. The Greeks ate it, the Romans cooked with it, And it's tempting to picture a Roman table with deep red beetroot on it, the way you'd find it today. That picture is almost certainly wrong. The ancients valued beet mostly for its leaves, not for a swollen root. There's no clear sign the familiar bulbous beetroot even existed in antiquity. What they knew was leafier, closer to chard than to the purple globe in your fridge. But picture the kitchen anyway. A Roman cook, a pot over the fire, a handful of beet leaves wilting into the water, the steam rising off it. Then the seasonings the Roman recipe tradition actually calls for, ground and stirred in one by one. Leeks, coriander, cumin, a splash of raisin wine, oil, vinegar, mustard. This isn't some exotic curiosity written up by a fascinated traveler. It's a plain green vegetable in an everyday dish, treated as ordinary, and it was already leading a double life. In the ancient world, food and medicine weren't cleanly separated. Greek and Roman writers on medicine described more than one kind of beet and assigned each its own supposed powers. Whether those remedies did anything is another question, but people believed in them, and belief was enough to keep the plant close. So long before anyone dreamed of extracting sugar from it, the beet was both dinner and remedy. Familiar, useful, ordinary. The extraordinary part hadn't been invented yet. Somewhere between the ancient world and the early modern one, the beet changes shape. You can't pin it to a date. Plants don't transform on a schedule. But the written record starts to shift in the 16th century, when botanists begin describing beets with genuinely swollen roots. Round, red, turnip-like roots, set down on the page for the first time. That's the beetroot surfacing into history. Not identical to what's in your fridge, but close enough to recognize. And as the root grew, the plant split. Because the beet isn't really one crop. It's a plant you can pull in different directions at once, each version bred for a different job. Push it toward leaves, and you get chard. Push it toward an edible root, and you get the garden beet. Push it toward sheer bulk, and you get fodder beet and the mangelwurzel, grown to fatten livestock through the lean months. Push it, much later, toward sugar, and you get something no earlier farmer could have imagined. This is the pattern to watch for. Nobody ever sat down and decided what the beet was for, once and for all. Each era looked at the same plant, saw a different problem it might solve, and pulled it in that direction. The Greeks and Romans wanted leaves and medicine. Northern farmers wanted winter food. Chemists wanted sugar. Empires wanted independence. And every time, the beet quietly obliged, because buried in that unglamorous plant was more flexibility than anything so ordinary had a right to hold. One species, many destinies. Before the beet became any of that, it earned its keep through something far less glamorous. It kept. In Northern Europe, that mattered more than flavor. Consider what winter actually meant before refrigeration, before global shipping, before a supermarket could fly green beans across a hemisphere in January. For most people, through most of history, the cold months were a slow arithmetic of what you had managed to put away. You ate down your stores and hoped they lasted until the ground softened again. A bad harvest in autumn wasn't an inconvenience, it was a countdown. And in that arithmetic, a crop you could pull out of the earth, brush the dirt off, and eat in February was not a humble vegetable. It was insurance. It was the difference, in a hard year, between hunger and getting through. Picture the cellar in the dead of winter, the fields frozen hard, the greens long gone, the fruit gone with them, the daylight thin and short. And down in the dark, in boxes of sand, rows of beets, still solid, still edible, months after they left the ground. A root pulled in autumn could last deep into the year. That's why the beet, and its bulkier cousin, the mangelwurzel, spread across northern Europe not as a delicacy, but as a hedge against disaster. Farmers grew fields of the coarse, heavy roots to carry their livestock through the winter, because an animal that starved in January was an animal you couldn't work or eat or sell in spring. The same logic that stored beets in a human cellar stored them in a barn. The plant had become, in the most literal sense, a way of banking the summer's sunlight against the months when the sun gave nothing back. That's the beet's quiet genius, a way of moving the calories of autumn into the hunger of February. It didn't have to be delicious to matter. It only had to be there when nothing else was, which is exactly the quality that would matter again, much later, when it wasn't winter emptying the shelves. It was war. But first, someone had to notice what was hiding inside the root. People had always known some plants tasted sweet. Tasting sweetness is easy. Turning it into a usable, sellable commodity is not. The first hint comes in 1600, when the French agronomist Olivier de Serres noticed that boiled beet juice resembled sugar syrup. He wrote it down. And then, for nearly a century and a half, essentially nothing happened. The breakthrough came in 1747 in a Berlin laboratory. The German chemist Andreas Sigismund Marggraf showed that the sugar in beets was the same sugar found in sugarcane, and that it could be pulled out of the root. Marggraf went further than tasting. He took dried beet, ground it, treated it, and examined the residue under one of the early microscopes. And there, in it, he found tiny crystals, matching the form of crystals from cane sugar. It was one of those rare moments where a scientist doesn't just suspect something, but sees it directly. The sugar Europe was importing from the other side of the world, at enormous cost, in ships guarded by warships, was sitting inside a root that grew in a German field. He published the finding, and then, for the most part, the world shrugged. The sugar was there, yes, but there was so little of it, and getting it out was so laborious, that no sane merchant would choose beet over cane. A discovery isn't the same as a disruption. Marggraf had proven the beet could hold sugar. He had not made anyone care, which is the whole problem in one sentence. The root was no longer only food. It contained a commodity, a hidden industrial substance, locked inside a common vegetable, waiting for someone to get it out affordably. Knowing sugar was in there was one thing. Making it pay was another entirely. That would take a student. Marggraf's work passed to his student, Franz Karl Achard, who turned the curiosity towards something practical. Achard did the unglamorous, decisive work. He bred beets, selecting for higher sugar, nudging the plant to concentrate more sweetness in its root. And he worked on the extraction itself, whether this could ever be more than a laboratory trick. In the opening years of the 19th century, backed by the King of Prussia, Achard built a sugar beet farm and processing works in Silesia, the first real attempt to make beet sugar an industry instead of an experiment. And here, it's worth being honest about how strange Achard's position was. He was betting his life's work on a crop almost everyone considered a joke. Cane sugar was cheap, abundant, and centuries established. Proposing to replace it with a European root struck many people as absurd, the kind of thing a crank chemist tinkers with while serious men trade in the real commodity. He was mocked, his methods were doubted, the economics were, on paper, indefensible. And yet he kept selecting his beets, generation after generation, pushing the sugar content up a fraction at a time, building the machinery to extract it, because he could see something the market couldn't yet, that the beet's disadvantage was purely a matter of price, and price is the one thing a war can change overnight. A chemist had proven the sugar was there. A breeder had improved the plant. Now an industrialist had built the factory. And still it ran into one obstacle it couldn't clear on its own. Why would anyone buy beet sugar when cane sugar already existed, and existed more cheaply? Under ordinary conditions, they wouldn't. Beet sugar was a solution waiting for a problem large enough to justify it. The problem was about to arrive, wearing a general's coat. To see why war changed everything, picture where Europe's sugar came from. Not from Europe. It came from cane, grown thousands of miles away in tropical colonies, and carried home across the ocean. Follow one shipment backwards, and the trail runs from a European coffee cup, onto a ship, across the Atlantic, to a Caribbean plantation. And there the trail stops at something that can't be dressed up. That sugar was produced by enslaved people on plantations built for that purpose. The sweetness in Europe's kitchens was inseparable from colonialism and from slavery, and from the navies that guarded the ships carrying it home. And that was the weak point. Sugar didn't just sit in the cup. It moved across water. Anything that moves across water can be stopped. A temperate European route that happened to hold the same sucrose was about to walk into the middle of that system. This time, not as a curiosity, but as a rival. All it needed was for the sea to close. In the early 19th century, France and Britain were locked in a war that spanned the continent. Britain's advantage was the ocean. Its navy could throttle Europe's commerce, blockade its ports, and cut off the colonial goods Europe had come to depend on. Napoleon's answer was to fight economics with economics. On the 21st of November, 1806, he issued the Berlin Decree, launching the Continental system, an attempt to bar British trade from much of the continent and strangle Britain financially. But a blockade cuts both ways. Seal off your enemy's ships, and you seal off your own supply. And one of the things that stopped arriving was cane sugar. Picture it from the street. A shop in Paris, the sugar barrels scraped empty, prices climbing week by week. Sugar, by the early 19th century, was no longer a luxury for the rich. Ordinary people had grown used to it, in their coffee, their tea, their preserves. So when it vanished from the shops, it wasn't only a gap in the pantry, it was a small daily reminder in every household that the war had reached into the kitchen. Finding a new source of sugar was no longer a curiosity. It was worth the full attention of a state at war. And a question was forming that would have sounded absurd a generation earlier. Could Europe make its own sugar, without the tropics, without the colonies, without the ships? There was, in fact, a candidate. It had been in the ground the whole time. Margraf had already found the sugar in it. Achard had already built a factory around it. Here's where the easy version of the story goes wrong. Napoleon did not invent beet sugar. He didn't discover the sugar in the root, and he didn't build the first factory. All of that already existed. What Napoleon did was supply the two things the beet had always lacked: urgency and scale. So the imperial machine turned toward the beet with a force nothing in its history had ever brought to bear on a vegetable. Prizes, land, and schooling were thrown behind it. What had been one stubborn chemist's obsession became, almost overnight, state policy. The beet went from a curiosity a few enthusiasts believed in, to a strategic crop an emperor was personally invested in seeing succeed. And Napoleon took a personal interest in the most literal way. On the 2nd of January, 1812, he walked into Benjamin Delacerte's beet sugar factory at Passy to see it for himself. Hold that image: fields of a dull, ordinary root outside. Inside, heat and noise and the thick, sweet smell of boiling juice. Roots washed and shredded, pressed and pulped, the brown liquid cooking down for hours in the copper pans until it thickened. Workers move between the vats in the steam, and one of them leads the emperor down the line. Here the shredding, here the presses, here the pans where the syrup darkens and reduces. At the end of it, someone scrapes out the first grains, pale and gritty and turning white, and puts them in his hand. And there stands the most powerful man in Europe, the one who had just redrawn the map of a continent, holding a fistful of sugar that had come not from a colony, not from a ship, but from a vegetable pulled out of French soil. The emperor and the vegetable, in the same room. The story goes that he was impressed enough to take the Legion of Honor ribbon from his own coat and pin it on Delacerte on the spot. Whether that detail is exact or polished by retelling, the meaning is the same. Sugar had just been turned into a matter of state. And within weeks he made it official, ordering an enormous expansion. Plans for roughly 100,000 hectares of beet, alongside new schools, scientific training, and a wave of new factories licensed across the empire. A humble route, native to European coasts, was now written into imperial policy. Not as food, as strategy. That's the sharpest irony in the beet's whole history. It never fired a shot. It never crossed a battlefield. But it was drafted into a war all the same, because a war had made the thing inside it suddenly precious. For a few years, under that imperial pressure, the beet sugar industry bloomed across the continent, most of it in France. An industry that had barely existed a decade earlier now dotted the map. But it stood on a single, fragile condition. Beet sugar wasn't winning because it was cheaper or better. It was winning because the blockade had removed its only rival. Restore the ships, and the whole case collapses. Which is exactly what happened. Napoleon's empire fell, the continental system came apart, the sea reopened, and cheap colonial cane came flooding back. Picture the reversal from a factory yard. Boilers going cold, the copper pans scraped out and left to tarnish, gates chained, the machinery that an emperor had ordered into existence falling silent. One works after another shutting its doors as the cheap cane came ashore. And the collapse, when it came, was not gentle. Men who had sunk their savings into beet sugar works on the strength of imperial promises watched the price of cane fall through the floor and their own product become worthless almost overnight. Fields that had been turned over to beet were turned back. The specialized machinery, built for one purpose, was sold for scrap or left to rust. Whole districts that had reorganized their farming around the emperor's decree were suddenly stranded, holding a crop nobody wanted at a price nobody would pay. For most of the men involved, it was simply ruin. The beet had promised them a fortune under the blockade, and peace had quietly repossessed it. The vegetable that had been lifted up by war was very nearly finished off by peace. And yet something survived that no closure could erase. Europe now knew, had proven at real scale, that ordinary temperate fields could grow sugar. You can shut a factory, you can't unlearn a fact. France kept at it, and now the story turns from political power to patient engineering. The problem had never been possibility. Ashard had settled that. The problem was efficiency. Too much cost, too little sugar. So that's what improved. Better breeding gave the beets more sugar. Better machinery pulled more of it out, more cheaply. Government tariffs sheltered the young industry from imported cane just long enough for the technology to catch up. And slowly, the numbers turned. Through the 19th century, beet sugar became genuinely competitive, not because a blockade propped it up, but because it had finally gotten good enough to win on its own. By mid-century, it was a major European industry, and it stopped being Napoleon's wartime gamble and became a permanent fixture of the landscape. That's the truer lesson, and it's more satisfying than the myth. War created the opening, but war didn't keep it open. Technology did. The beet had gone to war once, through Napoleon. It would go again, though never so dramatically. The 20th century broke Europe's food systems more than once, and each time the same pattern returned. When supply lines hold, a hardy, storable root barely registers. When they break, it's everything. In the worst shortages of the First World War, as transport failed and food grew scarce, families across parts of Europe fell back on the coarse, stored roots they'd normally have fed to animals. The humblest crops suddenly standing between people and hunger. A generation later, the Second World War brought the crisis back, and this time Britain felt the ocean close. German U-boats hunted the shipping lanes an island nation lived by, and governments urged people to grow their own food. Across the Atlantic, the same logic produced America's victory gardens, millions of them, dug into backyards and vacant lots. The beet was never the whole story of those gardens. Plenty of vegetables were, but it earned its spot for the plainest reasons. It was hard to kill. It gave both a root and a pot of greens from a single planting, and it would wait patiently in the cold ground until a family needed it. So, the vegetable that went to war means something sharper than beets being eaten in wartime. War, again and again, changed what people needed from the plant. And the beet was already there, quietly able to give it. Set the wars aside, and the beet still has one more trick, the one you've probably cursed over a cutting board. Cut a red beet, and the color escapes. It bleeds into your hands, the water, the wood, everything it touches. That pigment is mostly betanin, one of a family of compounds called betalains. And beetroot is one of the world's major commercial sources of them. Modern industry has done to the beet's color exactly what it once did to the beet's sugar: learn to harvest it. Extracted and refined, the pigment becomes a food colorant known as beetroot red, E162 in the European system, tinting drinks, sweets, dairy, sauces, and processed food a deep red or purple. The strange part is that we didn't invent that color. The plant was already making it. We just worked out how to take what it was producing anyway. The same pigment that stained a Roman cook's hands now runs through a modern food factory. Today, the beet has picked up one more identity: wellness food. Its nitrates and pigments have made it a subject of research into blood pressure and exercise performance. Once again, people have found a new reason to want something this plant was already producing. So look at a modern sugar beet in a field. It's about the least dramatic sight in agriculture: rows of heavy, dull roots in the mud. But you're not looking at a vegetable. You're looking at the end of thousands of years of selection, a living storage tank, bred to pack the energy of sunlight into its root as pure sucrose. Sometimes we eat it, sometimes animals do, sometimes a factory turns it into the white sugar in your kitchen, which is worth a thought the next time you reach for it. It might have crossed an ocean as tropical cane, out of an economy built on slavery. Or it might have come from a beet grown in cold European soil, out of an industry born because an emperor couldn't get the cane. Same sweetness, histories that could hardly be further apart. Now pick up an ordinary red beet in the produce aisle. Nothing about it looks imperial. Nothing about it looks industrial. Nothing about it looks like war. But inside that root is all of it. A plant gathered off a coastline, leaves eaten by Romans, a root reshaped by farmers, sugar found by a chemist, factories ordered by an emperor who couldn't get cane, gardens dug because the ships weren't safe. And now it's ordinary again. Cheap, unremarkable, its whole enormous history invisible on the shelf. The beet never looked like a weapon. It never had to.